Today, I want to talk about John Marshall. I want to look at how the Supreme Court slowly changed during his time, and how it became central to the American constitutional system. This episode is meant to help with English listening, and hopefully it also makes the history interesting and easy to follow. John Marshall and the Making of Judicial Power. In American constitutional history, the people who truly decided how the country works were not always presidents, and not always members of Congress. Many important institutional changes did not happen on election night, but inside written court decisions. The first Supreme Court Chief Justice in the true sense of the word, John Marshall, was one of the most influential figures in shaping the American constitutional system. If we only look at his resume, Marshall does not seem very impressive. He was never president, and when he first took office, he was not especially famous. But if we look at the institutional results, he almost single-handedly shaped the role of the judicial branch in the American system, and in some ways even reshaped the boundaries between executive and legislative power. When Marshall became Chief Justice, the Supreme Court was nothing like what it is today. In the late 18th century, courts were not seen as the center of political power. Congress made the laws, the executive branch enforced them, and the judiciary was more like a supporting institution. It lacked funding, lacked prestige, and its decisions were often ignored. The Supreme Court did not even have a permanent building, and justices had to travel around the country to hear cases. More like part-time judges, in other words, before Marshall, the Supreme Court was not a true center of power. Marshall's career began in this almost insignificant situation. He was not born into the legal elite. Unlike many later judges, Marshall came from a modest background and received limited formal education. But his experience in the American Revolutionary War was extremely important. As an officer in the Continental Army, he saw chaos caused by weak central authority, with state governments acting independently and the army lacking unified command. This experience strongly shaped his later decisions. His concern about a weak central government was not abstract theory. It came from real experience. Because of this, Marshall was always a strong supporter of the Federalist position. He believed that a central government that could not provide a unified interpretation of the Constitution and could not restrain the states would eventually fall apart. This belief would later be written into American institutions. Through judicial decisions, step by step, Marshall truly entered the center of history in 1801. When he was appointed Chief Justice, the political situation was extremely delicate. The Federalists had just lost the election. Power was about to transfer to their political opponents, and Marshall himself had been Secretary of State under the outgoing President John Adams. Because of this highly political background, his judicial career began under strong suspicion that he was a partisan judge. Yet it was exactly under this pressure that Marshall achieved his most important institutional breakthrough. In 1803, the case of Marbury v. Madison reached the Supreme Court. On the surface, it was simply a dispute over a government appointment. The new administration refused to deliver a commission to an official appointed by the previous government, and Marbury asked the court to force the government to act. But Marshall quickly saw that the real value of the case was not about who got a job, but about a deeper question. Did the Supreme Court have the power to declare an act of Congress invalid? In his decision, Marshall did something extremely skillful and politically intelligent. He did not directly challenge the executive branch, and he did not openly take sides. Instead, through careful legal reasoning, he reached a conclusion that appeared restrained but was actually revolutionary. He ruled that the court could not force the executive branch to deliver the commission, because the law that granted the court that power was unconstitutional. Marshall first admitted a fact that was unfavorable to the government. Marbury's appointment was legally valid, and the executive branch was wrong to withhold the commission. This meant that if the court had the authority to intervene, Marbury was right in principle. But Marshall did not continue down that path. Instead, he shifted to another question. Did the Supreme Court have the authority to directly order the executive branch to take action? To answer this, he examined a key issue: whether the law granting this power to the court was itself valid. He found that Congress had passed a law that attempted to expand the Supreme Court's original jurisdiction, allowing it to issue such orders. But the Constitution clearly listed the court's original jurisdiction, and Congress did not have the authority to expand it through ordinary legislation. In other words, the issue was not whether the court wanted to help Marbury, but whether Congress had the right to give the court that power. Marshall therefore reached a conclusion that was bad for Marbury personally, but extremely powerful at the institutional level. The court could not force the executive branch to act, not because Marbury lacked rights, but because the law granting that power violated the Constitution and was therefore invalid. Here, Marshall clearly stated for the first time that when a law conflicts with the Constitution, the court must follow the Constitution and refuse to enforce the law. The real importance of this statement was that it declared the Supreme Court as the final interpreter of the Constitution. At this moment, Marshall formally established the principle of judicial review, the idea that courts have the authority to determine whether laws comply with the Constitution and to reject them if they do not. This power was not explicitly written into the Constitution. It was created through precedent. From this point on, the Constitution was no longer just a political document, but the highest law protected and interpreted by the judiciary. This step completely changed the structure of American power. The Supreme Court was no longer just an institution that explained laws. It became the final guardian and interpreter of the Constitution. More importantly, this power was not gained through a revolution or a constitutional amendment, but through a single, carefully reasoned decision that was almost impossible to refute. If Marbury v. Madison established the position of the judiciary, Marshall's later decisions systematically strengthened the authority of the federal government. In McCulloch v. Maryland, Marshall faced a situation where states tried to limit a federal bank by taxing it. In his decision, he established two principles that are still quoted today. First, the Constitution grants the federal government not only powers that are explicitly listed, but also implied powers that are necessary and proper to carry out those listed powers. Second, states cannot use taxation or other means to interfere with legitimate federal functions. What did this mean? It meant that state authority was clearly placed below federal authority at the judicial level. Marshall was not denying the existence of states. He was defining a clear hierarchy. Under the Constitution, federal power comes first, and states operate within their proper roles. The same logic appeared in his rulings on commerce and contracts. In cases like Dartmouth College v. Woodward and Gibbons v. Ogden, Marshall emphasized the stability of contracts and the federal government's authority over interstate commerce. On the surface, these were business disputes. In reality, they removed institutional barriers to a national market. Without these decisions, the United States might have remained economically fragmented, with states blocking each other and acting independently. It is important to note that Marshall's influence did not come from aggressive political language. Instead, he strongly pursued unified opinions within the court and avoided divided rulings. He understood that a divided Supreme Court would weaken its own authority. He deliberately minimized his personal style and placed institutional logic above personal expression. When Marshall died in 1835, it was already difficult for Americans to imagine a constitutional system without a powerful Supreme Court. This was not because the Constitution had been changed, but because it had been reinterpreted and put into operation in a new way. In this sense, Marshall was not simply interpreting the Constitution. He was building a judicial framework that allowed the Constitution to function over the long term. He turned abstract principles into enforceable rules and transformed a fragile federal structure into a stable institutional reality. If the United States is a continuously running institutional machine, then John Marshall did not replace its parts. He defined where its main axis lies and who holds final interpretive authority. His influence was quiet but deep, and it continues to shape the basic structure of American politics today.